So we've got quite a diverse sort of a team that join us and collaboratively brainstorm ideas, particularly around mobile learning and its relevance, I guess, particularly to distance education, remote education in the crisis of COVID-19. So we have just joining us, Fernando. So welcome, Fernando. And what I was hoping that we could do today was have a bit more of a brainstorm around this idea of hybrid teaching. How do we go about dual mode as we filter back to on campus? And this may be something that our New Zealand participants might have some useful tips for Australian participants, because we're already kind of filtering back to campus a little bit ahead of Australia. So I was hoping we might have some combined wisdom there. Fernando, do you want to introduce yourself to us?
Nice to meet you, everyone. I'm working in the Faculty of Architecture. I'm specialized in Canvas and online delivery. So I'm very interested to know what you are doing and of course, how we can work together as well.
And which university are you from, Fernando?
The University of Melbourne.
Great. Great to have you here. So I'm just going to go into screen sharing and just have a look at our Padlet. So I sent the link to the Padlet again. And we can have a bit of a brainstorm on this live again if we want to add stuff to it, comment, etc. All right. So my screen layout is a little bit different because I've first time I've gone into Zoom and chosen the use dual monitor mode. So it does seem slightly more friendly than it does with when you just use the single monitor mode. I can still see the chat and the participants, which is great. So here's a Padlet. Feel free to be editing it as we're talking. I have, I think, given most people on this group editing rights, so you should be able to add columns, hopefully, if you think there's something that we're missing. You should at least be able to make comments and add things to the various columns that are already there. So, yeah, how do we go about teaching in dual mode, you know, face-to-face and online at the same time to remote participants? And I think we kind of knocked around the idea last week that perhaps we start with thinking online by default, and effectively that becomes the default design mode for any activities, and then the face-to-face that kind of becomes enhanced with the online, rather than sort of treating it as the online participants as the add-on, because they will always get the poor experience if we do that. So any other thoughts around that? I'm sure Chris has some wisdom for us.
I do.
What do you think about that?
I'm sorry. I mean, yes,
as an approach?
I do. Well, you put me on the spot there.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's a big issue when we look at student evaluations that are already coming out of the current paradigm, but also when you talk about students who are in blended learning situations, that the virtual engagements are perceived as kind of afterthoughts. And I think, you know, it's absolutely critical then that we flip that around. I don't think we're going to have as much trouble with people figuring out their live face-to-face engagements. And so I think if we flip it around and we actually start thinking about the online stuff first, this is what we have to do. I run something called the Melbourne Teaching Certificate, which is an internal certification that you can get in higher education teaching, learning, and assessment for our staff. And of course, this semester we've had to go virtual, and what it typically consists of is a full day of face-to-face interactive group work and all of these things. And so I'm now having to, on the fly, in less than a month's time, convert all of this stuff into online engagements. And man, I got to tell you, it's forcing me to think more first about how you do the online stuff in a way that actually gets people interested. I'm not sure that's wisdom so much as it is commiseration.
So what are some of the strategies that you're looking at, Chris, for
Sure.
producing that interaction online that you would normally do face to face?
Well, one of the ones that I'm doing for my own practice, but also what we're talking about in when I put my developer hat on with subject teams is stop the one-to-one ratio thinking. In other words, if you have 2 hours of lecture, don't attempt to alliterate that into a 2-hour video or a 2-hour block of time in which you're doing something similar, because you're not appreciating the paradigm shift and the engagement that's going to be different. So, you know, that full day that I'm typically having with the participants, already we're rethinking this as a 3.5-hour session via Zoom with some breaks, in which we're going to have to use breakout rooms. We're going to have to sequence it differently. We're going to have to keep people rolling through different activities and prompts in order to keep them there, even just for less than half the time allocated. So I think a big factor is don't try and simply drag and drop whatever it is you were doing live, because it absolutely will not work.
Yeah, and trying to just basically turn on the camera via Zoom and do what you've done before is pretty sure way of turning people off.
Yeah.
And I do, notice in particularly a lot of just even meetings that you're never sure whether people are engaging even when they've joined a Zoom meeting, because it's quite easy to just turn your video and your audio off. And then of course you don't know if they're even there at that point. And it's quite convenient, when you want to go and make a coffee or you prefer to answer emails and stuff. So just because you've joined a Zoom session doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually engaging.
I'm debating, by the way, whether or not how to do that. I'm talking right now with Dina and a few of the other support staff at our center, where, what do I do? Because I'm going to have 25, 27 people, but they're not undergraduates, they're my colleagues, and they start turning off the video. And, it's like, do I say anything? Do I do something?
Put some ground rules and say, do not turn your camera off.
Well, I mean, I can, but at the same time, I like the idea of partnering with people around their own development, especially if you're talking about, colleagues and adult learners who, they're, I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little too critical, but there almost seem to be some power dynamic issues if I begin setting rules about what you can and can't do.
Sure.
With your Zoom display,
Yeah, I agree. I was just kind of thinking, what about, instead of it being, I'm assuming it's probably not, but, instead of it being sort of presentation based, that you change it around and all participants have to, do a short presentation themselves. And so you're kind of dividing the responsibility, and hopefully they're, instead of having to do a half-hour presentation or something, if you've got 25 people there, they're all doing a 3-minute presentation type of thing on a topic.
I think absolutely, and there's ways to do it. Like what we're doing is I brainstormed this a little with a couple folks, and instead of having the full day session as a more didactic engagement, which is, not that it was to begin with, there was some group work. I just inherited this and taught it for the first time, and I'm changing it around. So instead, what we're doing is front loading with some video and audio material that I'm going to ask people to look at first. And then a couple weeks beforehand, we then meet up, relatively brief didactic process. And then we move into breakout groups. I'm going to get a few colleagues to come in with me, handle the breakout groups. And we're going to capitalize on what the materials were that I asked them to work with. So it's very much kind of a flipped modality, where you're pushing out of the actual engagement the more onerous activities that could be just as easily accomplished on your own. But then you're making a connection to those. so that people recognize when they walk into that Zoom meeting, they really do have to be a bit prepared. And given our numbers, we're looking at a breakout room with maybe 6 people. And that's tight enough that everyone gets to contribute. And we're not sure yet, but maybe a panel, you know. Then for the final part, we all come back together. One person from each of the Zoom breakout rooms has been assigned the activity as kind of the room discussant. So they're going to talk a bit about what went on and, you know, play around with some of the arguments. And then my role and the role of maybe one of my other colleagues will be the overall discussion to try and, you know, synthesize it all together. So yeah, absolutely. It's got to be a much more dynamic activity where people are constantly, you know, you got to be there.
Yeah. And what about ideas for actually sharing what each different group has created, produced, you know, their brainstorm. You know, it could be a scribble on a piece of paper that they take a photo of and then share, or it could be, you know, like we're doing with Padlet, an online Padlet.
That's a great idea. I had not explored that yet, but as you're saying this, because we're going to have the Canvas shell for the teaching certificate up early, and we're going to have it nice and stable. And so what I'm thinking is that we can simply create an area where we have a bit more visual graphic representation. Maybe we have people do a mind map, or maybe we just have them scan in or take a photo of some of the scribbles that they did. So that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, you could have a collaborative mind map as well. So something like MindMeister, you can have multiple people working on, just a bit like we were doing with the Padlet too.
Yeah, that's nice. That's a great idea.
So, those sorts of tools, I guess it's kind of thinking through how to share that interaction, so it's not just these little Zoom meetings going along parallel, but there's something that everyone can contribute to and produce some combined wisdom.
Tom?
Yeah, Neil.
One thing I've done is just share a Google Doc or Google, you know, the Excel version, and I just have a column for each breakout room, and then each breakout room fills in their own column, and so you can compare across columns what each group has done.
And I guess you can gamify that as well by, you know, adding a little bit of a competitive element into it, and you know, which groups come up with the best ideas or the most are the most productive or something.
Yeah.
One thing we did, sorry, did I just interrupt you, Neil? This is the odd thing of Zoom, is that you don't know when people have finished. So one thing that we did to establish the Zoom rules to begin with were how to ask a question and when it's time to talk, or number one, number two, because the chat function is sometimes hard to see with leading up to it. But we did use the breakout room whiteboard and then put someone in charge of taking a screenshot and then putting that back on a collaborative Padlet at the end. And that worked really well for some of the intensives that we put Zoom, and because it was DHB, some of the participants were able to be in a room together. So we preset the breakout rooms to have them as a breakout room of their own, and then the other people who were online participating remotely. The tasks or the scenarios or the role plays, and then coming back and feeding back to the whole group about what happened when they were out in the breakout room, and just the whiteboard notation up on a Padlet afterwards allowed further discussion afterwards with a comment thing. So it was really interesting what Zoom is possible. And of course, someone else running the admin side of it worked really well. So it wasn't you trying to teach and put up the poll that you'd previously made and that kind of thing. But it was really effective for the 2-day workshop that we did.
Yeah, I'm also kind of thinking, you know, relating this back to, I guess, the core theme of the series is mobile learning. How can mobile devices enable some of this as well? And I guess the key easy one there is they've all got cameras. So it's a great way to be able to take photos of various evidence and activity. And it could be as simple as I said before, everyone's scribbling on a piece of paper their ideas, and you just use your phone to take a photo of that and share it. But also maybe creating a back channel. So Gabriel was talking about the chat, but perhaps you can have something like a Twitter back channel going as well. And I think we did sort of talk about this a little bit last week. you know, ways to really make that engaging is to perhaps have someone assigned to moderate that, to, you know, seed conversations, or even in the chat inside Zoom to answer questions, because it's quite hard as the facilitator to split your attention between, you know, the video, the screen sharing, the chat, participants, you know, perhaps assigning different activities to different participants, and that's a way to get them engaged as well if you've got a role to play.
I think
So
it's really interesting.
Yeah, sorry, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, you raised an interesting point there about chat. In some ways, it's good. In other ways, it's kind of distracting. It's kind of like being at a meeting and in a room, a physical meeting that is, and people scribbling notes on a piece of paper and passing them around. Obviously we don't do that in meetings, do we? So I think the question is, what's the legitimacy of chat in functions like this?
Yeah, I guess it depends if it's an activity that you've actually designed in what you're doing, or whether it's just something that people are doing in the background, and whether they turn their cameras off to go and do something.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's individual rules that should be set. You know, I think, you know, as I said, I think chat can be a really good function. However, if the meeting's going to be a lot more serious, then that may be a ground rule where you say, okay, we're not going to, you know, participate in chat or any other function. This is purely about this meeting. So I guess it boils down to the nature of the meeting and you know, what's the purpose? Is it going to be a brainstorming meeting? Therefore, chat would be a good thing. However, if it's going to be more kind of focused kind of meeting, then perhaps then you put the ground rules down and say we're not having chat in this meeting. Look, I'm just putting thoughts out there. You know, I haven't really thought about it before, but it's just been raised, and I think, you know, perhaps, you know, we you know, there should be kind of further rhetoric around the legitimacy of chat. You know.
Yep, no, definitely keen for this to be a brainstorm, and, you know, if we come up with new ideas we haven't thought of before, that's great. Yeah.
Just as a language teacher, for me, the chat is absolutely vital to put in support for the students while they're off, practicing their language in some form or other. The chat gives them some structure and some scaffolding for language or the task that they might use to remind them of what it is. So for actually teaching purposes, I think language teaching purposes, the chat has been a really useful resource, and I couldn't imagine not having the chat, actually, to be honest. It's really important.
Yeah, and I guess also from an accessibility perspective as well. You know, there must be tools that allow you to transfer the text in the chat to audio or something if someone's visually impaired. I'm not sure, actually. I haven't tried. So I'm interested to get some thoughts from Steve, because we've sort of been knocking around the edges of the idea of flipped learning. And I know Steve's done a fair bit of work around that with his own teaching, and it'd be great to hear some of the strategies that you come up with, Steve, and kind of effectively flipping the classroom. I guess I'm always a little bit reticent around the idea of flipping, because it can just become, you're not actually changing anything as far as the pedagogy goes. All you're doing is changing the time when activities happen. And you're transferring the time that you do in class with the time that you do your homework, but neither activities are actually changed as such. So yeah, keen to hear your ideas, Steve, around how you've gone about changing the interaction, effectively flipping the classroom, etc.
Look, so predominantly the paper I teach is very content heavy. It covers just a massive amount of workload for the students, and consistently year after year the feedback was that there was too much content, and so again it was classroom based, face to face. I would stand in front of the class of 50 for several hours upon hours, trying to work my way through this detail, which didn't give me too much satisfaction, and certainly wasn't great satisfaction for them. Albeit, they enjoyed aspects of it. So I front loaded the content via Adobe Spark in small bite-sized sections, which lasted maybe 20-minute slots that they could listen to as an audio podcast, or if they wanted just some a little bit more context, I gave them some visual information which they could watch via a computer screen. Now, you mentioned time, Tom, of literally just converting a 2 or 3 hour session into the same thing online. Well, it wasn't actually. The smaller slots enabled students to get them in bite-sized bits of information. But I also found that instead of being didactic in front of a slide in a classroom face-to-face, the students would actually go back and have the ability to review and renew their knowledge based on the information I'd given them, to the point where with 50 to 70 students in a class, some of these Adobe Spark podcasts, videocasts, were being viewed 400 or 500 times each on a 20-minute tutorial. So it really gave them the opportunity just to put it into context and build their knowledge and learning, rather than, I guess, in front of a class, being able to take it all in with only one opportunity.
Has that transferred to doing this remotely now?
Well, the difficulty I've had is that whilst the content can be delivered in advance, I would complement the content with face-to-face time. The face-to-face time would be a classroom clinical simulation where I would put them into groups where they would review the simulation in these breakout groups, discuss, critique the simulation, and then come up with diagnosis based on what they saw and how the other students performed. This would then be put forward into group presentations. I don't know how to move that clinical hands-on experience into an online or mobile technology. I haven't quite found a way that I can move over to it being totally and purely remote.
What do you think about virtual reality and tools like SeekBeak for being able to give you at least some aspects of the clinical simulation experience remotely?
Yeah, I think it could lend itself. So SeekBeak is a program which is relatively straightforward and simple in as much as you or I can do it quite easily within an hour or so, and develop different scenes, scenarios, and images in a 360 format. But I think clinical evaluation is to an extent slightly different from most people, most students, most clinicians. And there are perhaps you can't take clothes off you. Well, it's difficult to get through the layers of complexity that you might well do in a hands-on patient presentation. And whilst you can go through layers within SeekBeak, it often requires some tactile intervention of being able to touch and feel a patient, and it's just, I'm not sure it's there yet.
Yeah, so I guess I'm just kind of thinking as you're talking. I was listening. Perhaps there's the opportunity for the hybrid mode when you do have a group of students who are face to face, that can somehow they can experience the actual simulation, using the high fidelity mannequins or people pretending to be sick or whatever, and then perhaps somehow they can relate that experience back to the remote students. Maybe they engage in a conversation with the remote students after having done the clinical simulation and give their thoughts, their feedback. What was it like to do that? I don't know. I'm just trying to
No.
think
You're absolutely.
how you know, because as you say, doing it completely remotely is really, really difficult. But in a hybrid mode, perhaps there's the opportunity for you to be able to bridge that somehow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it was mentioned quite early on that we need to change our mindset as to not necessarily having the students as who are distance as an afterthought, but actually making them a prime learner within our programs, and developing the content online kind of does that. But when I come to class, you're right, it doesn't support the distance students in their learning. And in fact, the greatest learning is in the face-to-face situations where they do a clinical simulation. So I think it would be actually a really nice thing to try, is to bring
So in the
simulation.
face-to-face simulation, the other students that are there, are they critiquing the students doing the practice?
Yes.
So you could do that. So, you know, you could have a student with smartphone, or you can have a camera in the class, in the face-to-face class, streaming live the video to the remote students, and the remote students can be given critique on their technique of the people actually doing the simulation. So like a peer review process.
Yeah, absolutely. And there'd be no reason, dependent on numbers, that they couldn't be another breakout group, a distance breakout group, so that they could interact together and perform, have the same discussion, critique, and development of diagnosis and ideas, and then present that in the same way or format as somebody in the class. That's a great idea.
Yeah, and maybe even the remote students, you can design a VR experience that, you know, gives them some of that experience as well. But, you know, you could, like we've done, I guess, face-to-face with, obviously the stuff we've done with enhancing paramedic simulation physically, but with VR, it could be done the other way. So it's the same scenario in VR that the remote students are seeing as the face-to-face students are experiencing in class. And I think Vikal wanted to add something there. He had a brilliant idea, so I'll throw it over to Vikal.
I think we had this chat at our last meeting as well. But one of the things we also discussed was how the off-campus, so students who can't be on campus, can still do that sort of hands-on, but not being hands-on. So I think if we look at learning rather than just content, but reconceptualize that as what the students do with the content, then the whole debate over the binary of off-campus, on-campus is kind of like doesn't exist. But I can understand, Steve, what you're saying. But the thing is, if the students know what we're going to be doing in the simulation on campus, the off-campus students can prepare for it. They can prepare the procedure and and they can get someone who's on campus to follow exactly what they've done, to at least get that sort of hands-off experience, but they're actually in the driver's seat.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. The issue is that I have a brief outline as to how I would like the simulation to go, but it's not black and white. It's dynamic, and so one student might attack this patient. Wrong way, wrong term. Might have investigate this patient in one way. And conversely, another student might address it in a different way. And that's what it's about. It's about allowing them to take a step forward and develop their ideas there and now. And that promotes the discussion for the students in the class. But certainly,
I think something we're not really embracing in this time and period is the uncoupling of space and time. So if the student, say, for example, like what you're saying, Steve, if the student is given time to think about it individually, but when we actually do, like you're doing quite a lot of this on Zoom anyway, is when they actually come for the simulation, you can actually have students who are on campus in that space as well. But the thing is to get them into groups, which you're doing with the breakouts, to actually then discuss what their plan is. So again, it's about making that case available to every student. So there's this individual component, but there's also this collaborative component where they actually are discussing how you are going to handle it, how student Y is going to handle it, but they're actually creating that sort of generic or common knowledge about what is the right way with your guidance.
Yeah, and to an extent, I do that in class. with the breakout group. So they provide their presentation, and then once they've all provided their presentation on for diagnosis and evaluation of the simulation, then I'll come in and fill in the gaps. And it doesn't have to be just me. I guess, as you say, it could be in a wider context in the group.
And we also arrived at this last week, that there's never going to be any replacement for hands-on elements like nursing, paramedics, or anything medical, engineering, and things like that.
Well, in saying that though, the whole class is to develop critique and analysis, and so I think that could be done remotely. It's just the cognitive load in simulation that we can't replicate via distance, because it requires tactile use of the mannequin or the patient, and that's what we can't replicate, I don't think.
Or will just courier them out, Steve?
We'll see.
Yeah, it comes down to issue of cost, doesn't it? When your mannequins are $150,000 each or more. Okay, so great discussion, some good ideas there. Thank you, Steve. Any other thoughts from anyone else around hybrid teaching and how do we do it?
I guess mine's not around teaching, but it was around when we first went into COVID lockdown, and we were doing sessions via Collaborate for teaching staff on how to use different tools. And the first one that we had was about Collaborate. And we have a limit, well, we had a limit on Collaborate for 250 people, and anything over 250, it crashed people out. So I was watching the actual session attendees list go up, and we got up to about 200 and something, 260 something. And I guess it's just making sure that all those things that are limited before you go into a session are sorted out.
You've got enough capacity.
Yeah. So after that session, that Blackboard actually put the limit above 250, but it was how to actually set rules at the beginning too for the Collaborate session for people. We did end up turning the microphones off because we had lecturers who were trying to talk over people, etc. So it's making sure we've got those limits in place before we actually deliver things.
And what's the strategy for semester 2, Lisa, for AUT? With obviously expecting, I would assume, the bulk of students to be back face to face on campus, but
correct, yeah.
Surely there's going to be some students who choose not to. Maybe they still don't feel safe. I don't know. Is it going to be in a dual mode or not, or is it just going to be, if you can't come to campus, tough luck?
To tell you the truth, I actually don't know the answer to that at the moment. All I know is from experience from my daughter as a university student at AUT, and she said, I'm going back because I actually miss the class interaction. She said, I'm dying to get back. I want to get back in there and talk to my lecturers and talk to people face to face. So I don't know what the strategy is, but I will certainly find out and answer that next time.
Yeah, and I guess university students, particularly school leavers, tend to be in the low risk category as well, don't they, as far as COVID-19 goes? But certainly university lecturers are probably in the high risk category.
And my daughter had a lecturer, I won't name names, but there was a very monotonous kind of Collaborate sessions that they ran. And at one stage she pulled her headset out of the laptop and said, listen to this. And he wasn't actually collaborating. He wasn't actually giving feedback to students. They were just answering yes or no. So he wasn't actually using the time to actually get a right answer or, get them talking about stuff.
Yeah, lecture mode online.
Yeah.
I think that's just a bad, an example of a bad lecture, really.
Exactly.
It would have probably done the same thing in a lecture hall face to face,
Yeah. So,
just to add to what you just said there, Tom and Lisa, there's a policy being written at the moment by AUT that's going to be coming out about the choice from working from home. So I do know
for academics.
For academic teachers. So I don't know how that's going to impact or what, but the policy is still being written, and I know that there's somehow going to be judged on a departmental basis. If you can teach from from home or prefer to teach from home, then that option is still there. Yeah, you know, we're still waiting to see what it's going to look like, though.
So that would presuppose an online mode of teaching and learning, or would it be a teacher sort of remote into a classroom with students but no teacher there?
Who knows? I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. You know, does it open the fact that the students can choose to work from home, or is it they have to come into? I don't know. I think it's going to be problematic. I don't know. It's going to be something that's going to have to be worked through. I really don't know. But yeah, let's just watch this space and see what they come up with.
Yeah, interesting. I think Chris and then Neil wanted to say something. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, I wanted to say, you know, when we're just talking about Australia and New Zealand, it's going to be problematic, and there's going to be a lot of hiccups. But once we begin to expand the scope of this, you know, as an American, I'm looking at this and thinking, boy, this is going to be tremendously problematic.
Time zones.
Oh, well, time zones for one, but then also universities' response to state and federal policy issues in terms of opening and closure. I've got a friend who she's recovering from COVID right now. And so she's got to make the decision whether or not she's going to teach live in person in her university in New Jersey. Well, the problem is what we now know about the antibodies is that she's still going to have to rely on a bunch of 18 to 22-year-old undergraduates to actually practice social distancing when she's already in a weakened condition.
Yeah.
So from her point of view, the logical thing to do is to do most of this at distance and accept the difficulties of time zones and other things like that. But will she be allowed to? You know, will the university be put within a larger scale policy paradigm where they're allowed to make those decisions, or their individual instructors? I mean, it's really, yeah, we're in new territory, and it's not very welcoming territory.
Yeah. Okay, Neil.
Oh, thanks. I just wanted to follow up what Lisa was saying about whether students can be allowed to opt out of classes because they have anxieties about COVID. So in the school where I work, we have two excused absences. One is if a typhoon gets to a certain level, then you're allowed not to come. And the second one is flu. And then now added, the third one is COVID anxiety. So students they have an official excuse if they don't want to come to school when we go back to school. Because they're anxious. So we've been asked, you know, how do you cope with a group of students who are not there, but who are part of a class that are there? And these ideas about like streaming your class to a remote student at the same time the class is going on, that's actually a very helpful way to think about dealing with those students who have or may have COVID anxiety. So thanks for that.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think we're sort of about time up again. So thank you everyone for your thoughts and contributions, discussion. I think we've got some good ideas. You know, of course, every context is going to be a little bit different, but I think key comes down to just brainstorming that. What can you do and what can you learn from other contexts and build into your own. So thanks, Steve, for sharing yours. Great to have you on board, Gabrielle. So we'll hopefully see you again. We have these each Friday. And try to look at different topics, and we do occasionally get a guest expert in to do more of a sort of a webinar presentation. So we've got a bit of a Google spreadsheet where people can put ideas together for topics, so that'd be great if people want to add to that. So thank you everyone, great to see you again. I'll post this onto YouTube once we're finished. Thank you all.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Talk to you soon.